Power did not belong to the men who held the streets. It belonged to the men who held the information. You did not need to outrun the FBI. You did not need to hide. You just needed an agent who believed you were useful, and the patience to let everyone else get knocked down first. If you love stories about power, control, corruption, and quiet empires built in plain sight, make sure to follow, because this one ends where nobody expected it to. Boston, 1975. The FBI's organized crime squad worked out of a low brick building on New Sudbury Street, a short walk from the federal courthouse. Agents spent long days trying to crack the Patriarca family, the New England branch of La Cosa Nostra that ran gambling, extortion, and loan sharking from Providence to Portland. Their Boston crew operated out of Prince Street in the North End. They held meetings in a small storefront with wooden blinds pulled tight and envelopes laid on the desk every week. The FBI wanted that operation. They wanted indictments that reached deep into the hierarchy. They needed someone who could give them access without risking the entire investigation. That search led them to a man from South Boston, whom many people already knew by reputation. His name was James Bulger. People called him Whitey when he was young, though the nickname faded as he got older. He did not like it. He preferred to be addressed by his real name or not at all. By 1975, Bulger was 45 years old, a quiet, steady figure in the Winter Hill organization that operated out of Somerville. He was not the flashiest man in the group. He was not the loudest. But he understood how the city worked better than almost anyone. Bulger had already lived several lives by the time the FBI came calling. In the 1950s, he served 9 years in federal prisons, including time in Atlanta and Alcatraz, on armed robbery charges. He returned to Boston in 1965 and kept a low profile, working for the Killeen crew until a series of gang conflicts ended with Donald Killeen dead. After that, Bulger and his close associate, Stephen Flemmi, shifted allegiance to Howie Winter, the calm, organized leader of the Somerville-based Winter Hill Group. Winter's organization controlled bookmaking operations, loan sharking, and points on various independent rackets across the region. Bulger and Flemmi became some of its most reliable earners. What made this pairing remarkable was that Flemmi already had a relationship with the FBI dating back to 1965. His informant file was opened by Agent Paul Rico, a Boston native who believed the Italian mob posed the primary threat to New England and that the Irish organizations could be managed. By the mid-70s, Flemmi was both a Winter Hill member and a federal informant. When Bulger partnered with Flemmi, he stepped into a world where law enforcement and criminal enterprise were not always on opposite sides. The turning point came when FBI agent John Connolly returned to Boston. Connolly grew up in the same housing projects as the Bulger family. He remembered Whitey's younger brother Billy, who later became one of the most powerful political figures in Massachusetts. Connolly joined the bureau, spent time in other offices, and then received an assignment in Boston that brought him back to the streets he knew well. He understood the local culture. He understood the fear the Italian mob generated. And he believed that to bring down the Patriarca family, he needed someone from the Irish side who could provide real intelligence. Connolly approached Bulger in 1975. The meeting was quiet, deliberate, and unrecorded. The pitch was simple. The FBI wanted information on the Italians, not the Irish. The Bureau viewed the Patriarca family as the main target. Bulger and Flemmi dealt with the Italians occasionally. They heard things. They knew who collected envelopes, who skimmed from gambling operations, who argued with who, and where the internal problems were. Connolly offered protection in exchange for that information. Bulger would not be exposed. He would not be targeted. He would not be mentioned in federal investigations. In return, he had to deliver intelligence that advanced FBI priorities. Bulger understood the opportunity immediately. He was not naive about law enforcement. He knew how the federal system worked. He also knew that a man who provided information to the FBI, if protected properly, could operate with greater freedom than any rival. He accepted the arrangement. Connolly opened a file. Bulger was designated a top echelon informant, the highest grade the Bureau offered. It was a position that granted extraordinary cover if the handler protected the asset. The FBI told itself the arrangement was strategic. The Bureau believed the Italians represented the true organized crime threat. They believed weakening the Boston crew of the Patriarca family would bring stability and demonstrate federal strength. From their perspective, using Bulger and Flemmi to take down a more entrenched organization made tactical sense. They warned other agencies not to interfere. They restricted access to the files. They made sure only a small circle of agents knew the identity of the informants. Bulger played his role with precision. He did not offer everything. He never gave information that would harm his own operations. But he provided enough intelligence about meetings, loan sharking disputes, territory conflicts, and internal disagreements within the Italian organization to justify search warrants and surveillance orders. He gave names. He gave addresses. He gave just enough detail to help the FBI build probable cause affidavits. When the Bureau took credit for those arrests, the internal memos referenced a confidential source who had proven extraordinarily reliable. Bulger's name never appeared. The information that flowed both ways changed the balance of power in Boston. When local police or federal agents outside the circle began looking into Bulger's activities, Connolly intervened. He told them the Bureau needed Bulger for bigger cases. He redirected attention. He protected the source. Bulger's name disappeared from case files, targeting lists, and debriefings. He became a man with the freedom to move quietly without the usual pressure. Meanwhile, Howie Winter continued running the organization until 1978, when a federal horse race fixing case led to multiple convictions. Winter went to prison. The Winter Hill Group needed new leadership. Bulger and Flemmi stepped into the void. They did not hold a vote. They did not declare themselves bosses. They simply began collecting the money that once went to Winter. Bookmakers paid them weekly. Drug dealers paid them percentages. Local businesses made arrangements. The shift was quiet, steady, and widely accepted because everyone understood that the two men had protection that extended far beyond street power. The shift extended beyond South Boston. Flemmi managed operations on the North Shore, working with bookmakers, card game organizers, and independent operators who straddled the line between Winter Hill and the Patriarca family. Bulger held complete control of Southie. His neighborhood connections ran deep. His younger brother Billy held one of the highest political offices in the state. It created a combination of street influence and institutional respect that few criminals ever achieved. The violence remained selective. Prosecutors would later present evidence of murders tied to the Winter Hill organization, many committed to protect operations or punish internal theft. But during the 70s and early 80s, federal attention remained tightly focused on the Italian mob. Bulger understood this. He used it. Every time a rival organization faced federal pressure, Winter Hill's influence grew. Every time an Italian operation was raided, one less obstacle blocked the path to local dominance. The Teamsters also played a role. Local 25, with almost 2,000 members representing truck drivers, warehouse workers, and freight handlers, controlled labor peace on Boston's shipping docks and freight terminals. Leadership in the union was not directly tied to Winter Hill, but the organization heavily influenced the environment around it. Bookmakers taking bets from drivers, Shylocks lending money to members, drug suppliers operating in after-shift bars, all operated in territories where Bulger's people expected tribute. The union did not answer to Winter Hill, but the local leadership knew the cost of ignoring the group's presence. Meanwhile, the Bureau scaled up its efforts against the Patriarca family. Operation Bostar, a multi-year investigation, placed wiretaps inside the Prince Street headquarters run by underboss Gennaro Angiulo. The tapes captured hundreds of hours of conversations, discussions about gambling revenue, extortion payments, kickbacks, discipline measures. The evidence was devastating. In 1983, federal prosecutors used the wiretap results to indict Angiulo and his top associates. It crippled the Italian mob's Boston operations. The FBI celebrated the victory. Connolly received praise for his role in making the case possible. Nobody mentioned that the information stream that guided those warrants came partly from Bulger. By the early 80s, Bulger and Flemmi operated with nearly complete impunity. Bodies tied to the organization appeared occasionally, sometimes connected directly to disputes within the criminal world. Prosecutors and investigators encountered cases that lacked witnesses, lacked informants, lacked cooperation. Fear played a significant role. Many residents of South Boston believed that the FBI deliberately protected Bulger. Some believed the rumors, some dismissed them. But when investigations into drug distribution or extortion pointed toward Winter Hill, federal interest quietly evaporated. Inside the FBI, not everyone agreed with Connolly's approach. Younger agents, who grew up in a different era and were less connected to old neighborhood loyalties, questioned how effective the informant program really was. They noticed patterns. They noticed which investigations stalled. They noticed that certain names never appeared in internal reports. They filed concerns. Some were dismissed, some were reviewed. But as long as the Bureau kept securing convictions against the Italians, the broader system viewed the arrangement as successful. The arrangement began to shift in the mid-80s. The drug trade expanded rapidly. Cocaine flooded cities. South Boston was not immune. Independent dealers moved product through bars and clubs. Some paid Bulger. Some resisted. Those who resisted faced consequences. Some were intimidated. Some disappeared. Federal authorities received increasing reports of violent acts tied to Winter Hill. The Drug Enforcement Administration took notice. Their investigations often pointed directly at Bulger. When they coordinated with the FBI, they encountered resistance. Connolly labeled Bulger a protected source. The DEA viewed the situation skeptically. Tensions grew. Meanwhile, Local 25 faced scrutiny from National Teamsters leadership and federal prosecutors. The National Union was still reeling from corruption investigations. Federal authorities viewed Boston as an area of interest. Investigations began targeting labor racketeering, pension fund misuse, and links between union officials and organized crime. Local 25's leadership walked a delicate line. They needed cooperation from Winter Hill to maintain labor peace, but they also faced oversight from federal authorities determined to expose corruption. By 1988, the fragile arrangement that protected Bulger began to collapse. A federal grand jury launched an investigation targeting Winter Hill operations directly. New agents, unconcerned with past loyalties, built detailed cases using financial records, witness testimony, and independent intelligence. Flemmi was arrested. He began cooperating when faced with overwhelming evidence, eventually admitting involvement in multiple murders. The circle of protection around Bulger weakened. Connolly retired. New investigators pursued leads. The Bureau prepared indictments. And when word of the indictments leaked, Bulger vanished from Boston, igniting one of the longest fugitive searches in FBI history. When Whitey Bulger disappeared in 1994, it did not feel like a man running from justice. It felt like a man moving to his second home. Someone tipped him. Federal investigators later suspected a retired FBI agent. Others believed someone inside the state police. The truth never surfaced cleanly. What everyone agreed on was simple. Bulger knew about the sealed indictments before they reached the clerk's office. He packed cash, guns, documents, and left Boston without hesitation. A man who feared arrest would have panicked. Bulger behaved like someone who had been expecting the moment for years. Flemmi did not run. He stayed in Boston and got arrested. At first he resisted cooperation. He had lived through enough conflicts to believe loyalty offered more protection than the government ever could. But the evidence gathered by the new generation of federal agents was extensive. Financial records, surveillance logs, statements from associates, testimony from people who had once worked for Winter Hill and now faced long sentences. Flemmi knew the laws changed in the mid-1980s. The RICO statute made it possible to tie violent acts to the broader enterprise. The penalties were severe. Eventually, he faced choices that left cooperation as the only path away from a life sentence. His cooperation revealed a level of violence and federal complicity that stunned prosecutors. Flemmi admitted involvement in multiple murders, some tied to internal disputes, some tied to drug distribution conflicts, some tied to the protection of Bulger's organization. He described meetings. He described decisions. He described the relationship between Bulger and the FBI, the information that flowed both ways, and the warnings that protected their operations. His testimony formed the skeleton of the government's understanding of how the arrangement worked. Another Winter Hill member, John Martirano, came forward as well. He was known as a reliable enforcer. In court testimony and interviews, he admitted participation in 20 killings. He described motives, planning, and outcomes without visible emotion. Prosecutors used his statements to build the larger picture of how the organization operated, who benefited from the deals, and how the protection from law enforcement shaped the environment in South Boston and beyond. Martirano's testimony reinforced the scale of the consequences hidden behind the FBI's decision to prioritize cases against the Patriarca family. Inside the bureau, the fallout was significant. Internal Affairs opened inquiries. The Office of Professional Responsibility examined the agents who handled Bulger and Flemmi. Many of the key figures had retired. Some denied wrongdoing. Others claimed the decisions made sense given the priorities of the era. But documents, memos, and testimony painted a different picture. Supervisors approved the informant relationship without implementing safeguards. Investigators ignored warnings from other agencies. Files were managed in ways that shielded Bulger from scrutiny. By the time the inquiries concluded, senior officials acknowledged systemic failures. The most visible consequence fell on John Connolly. He had retired as a celebrated agent, known for dismantling parts of the Italian mob in New England. After Flemmi and Martirano testified, Connolly became a central figure in the investigation. Prosecutors charged him with racketeering, obstruction of justice, and providing information to Bulger that resulted in the murder of a potential witness. Connolly denied the charges. He argued that everything he did was part of his informant management duties. But the evidence produced at trial undermined his defense. Financial records showed unusual transactions. Witnesses described envelopes of cash. Former Winter Hill members recounted conversations in which Connolly allegedly provided warnings about upcoming investigations. The jury convicted him. He went to federal prison. Later state charges resulted in additional sentencing. Connolly became the symbol of a federal system that had lost its way. Meanwhile, the search for Bulger expanded. The FBI listed him among its most wanted fugitives. Tip lines flooded with false leads. Sightings were reported in Europe, South America, Canada, and multiple US cities. Nothing materialized. Years passed. Posters faded. The case shifted between agents. Some believed he had died. Others believed he lived under a new identity, somewhere far from New England. But a few investigators, particularly those who had studied his habits, believed he would choose a place where routine made him invisible. A place where an older couple could blend in. In 2011, federal marshals received a lead from a publicity campaign that targeted women who frequent beauty and cosmetic surgery clinics, focusing on Bulger's longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gray. The tip directed investigators to an apartment building in Santa Monica, California. Marshals canvassed the area and confirmed 2 people matching the descriptions lived in a rent-controlled building near the beach. Surveillance began. They waited until Bulger stepped into the garage. They arrested him without incident. He was 81 years old. Inside the apartment, investigators found more than $800,000 in cash, multiple weapons, and false identification documents. The couple had lived quietly for 16 years, paying rent in cash, rarely drawing attention. Neighbors described them as polite, reserved, and unremarkable. Nobody suspected one of the most wanted fugitives in federal history lived in the building. Bulger's trial began in 2013 in Boston federal court. The prosecution presented evidence of 19 murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and other criminal acts attributed to the Winter Hill organization. Witnesses included former associates, law enforcement officers, and family members of victims. Flemmi testified in detail. Martirano testified. Their statements outlined the structure and operation of the organization, and Bulger's role in ordering or participating in acts of violence. The defense attempted to undermine the credibility of the witnesses, arguing that cooperating witnesses traded testimony for reduced sentences. They argued that Bulger's informant relationship was exaggerated by prosecutors seeking to shift blame from the FBI. But documents, recordings, and multiple independent accounts supported the government's case. After 2 months of testimony, the jury convicted Bulger on most counts. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. Bulger was transferred to federal custody, eventually sent to a penitentiary in West Virginia. In 2018, he was moved to another facility. Within hours of arrival, he was killed by other inmates. Federal authorities never provided a clear explanation for why he was placed in general population despite his notoriety and the risks associated with informant cases. His death closed the final chapter on one of the most complicated and controversial criminal investigations in American law enforcement history. The aftermath shaped Boston for decades. South Boston changed. The housing projects where the Bulger family grew up were demolished and rebuilt as mixed-income developments. Property values rose. New businesses replaced old bars, bookmakers, and storefronts that once carried silent ties to Winter Hill. Younger residents knew the name Whitey Bulger mostly through movies, books, and documentaries. The lived experience, the fear, the silence, faded as the neighborhood changed hands. Teamsters Local 25 continued operating, but the industry transformed. Container shipping consolidated freight operations. Automation reduced the need for manual labor. Corporate mergers altered the dynamics between unions and employers. Federal oversight reduced opportunities for corruption. The quiet understanding that once guided relationships between union officials and organized crime no longer held the same power. The FBI underwent significant internal reforms. Informant policies were rewritten. Oversight structures were strengthened. Training programs used the Bulger case as a warning of how informant management can break down when personal relationships override institutional controls. Supervisors who once approved the arrangement faced scrutiny. Some were reprimanded. Some retired quietly. The Bureau acknowledged the failures publicly, though critics argued the reforms came too late for the people harmed during the years of protection. Boston remembered the story through hearings, court records, and occasional memorials. Newspapers revisited the case regularly. Documentaries attempted to capture the atmosphere of fear and control. Journalists interviewed retired investigators, prosecutors, and community members. Academics debated the ethical implications of informant relationships. Families affected by the violence sought closure through civil suits and public testimony. Each perspective provided another piece of a story that could never be fully resolved. Catherine Gregg served an 8-year sentence for harboring a fugitive. She refused to cooperate. She offered no information about their years on the run. After her release in 2020, she returned to Massachusetts and lived quietly. Some people respected her loyalty. Some condemned it. Most simply accepted that she made her choice long ago and never changed it. Billy Bulger's political career also faced lasting consequences. His refusal to answer questions during a congressional hearing on his brother's whereabouts led to public criticism and political pressure. He resigned from his position as president of the University of Massachusetts. He rarely discussed his brother in public. In private, he maintained that family ties did not justify criminal behavior. His memoir focused on his own career and accomplishments, acknowledging the broader environment without directly addressing his brother's actions. As the years passed, the story settled into the city's memory. Older residents remembered the fear, the unspoken rules, the understanding that certain people operated above law enforcement. Younger residents saw the case as part of history, something distant, shaped by forces no longer present. The Winter Hill era became a subject for true crime documentaries, books, and tours through former hangouts. In the end, the FBI deal that protected Whitey Bulger allowed him to build an empire in plain sight. It dismantled a rival organization while creating new victims. It produced high-profile convictions while concealing violent acts. And by the time the truth surfaced, the men who made the decisions had retired, changed jobs, or moved on. Accountability came slowly, if at all. The lessons remained. Power built through information can last longer than power built through force. Institutions can lose sight of consequences when focused on specific victories, and the people who lived under that arrangement remember the silence most. The quiet signals, the looks, the unspoken understanding that danger could come from the men who enforced the law as easily as from the men who broke it. Boston moved on. The city grew. Neighborhoods changed. But for those who remember, the story never really ended. It simply faded into the background of a place that learned, sometimes painfully, that the line between justice and corruption is rarely straight and never easy to walk.